What if the oldest message ever whispered to humanity was not carved in stone, but carried in fear, hope, and the desperate instinct to protect a child during a dangerous migration you will never witness? Imagine standing beside those first ancestors, feeling the cold air of an unknown land, sensing the weight of survival pressing against every breath. When we look back at prehistoric spirituality, at the symbolic messages left by ancient humans, we often focus on their myths or rituals. But beneath all of that lies something more intimate, more urgent, a hidden language born from the need to preserve life when the world was wild and unforgiving. This is where the story truly begins. As early humans crossed vast plains, mountains, and frozen landscapes, they carried not only tools and hopes, but a deep belief that unseen forces walked with them. These beliefs were not abstract ideas. They were protective signals shaped by experience, fear, and intuition. They were early psychological maps, guiding parents on when to move, where to rest, and how to shield their children from dangers they barely understood. When a mother sensed a shift in the wind or a hunter noticed unusual patterns in animal behavior, these moments were transformed into spiritual signs, encoded into stories that the entire group learned to trust. You can almost feel their tension, the awareness that every sound, every shadow might carry meaning. These were not superstitions. They were survival strategies, wrapped in symbolism. They learned to translate the natural world into warnings, blessings, and choices that could decide whether a child lived to see another dawn. And even today, when we examine these ancestral messages, it becomes clear that prehistoric spirituality was less about worship and far more about protection, intuition, and the raw psychology of safeguarding the young during migration. Have you ever felt that quiet pull inside you? The one that makes you pause, observe, question? You might be closer to those ancient instincts than you think. This connection between our past and our present is deeper than it appears, and what you are about to uncover may shift the way you view early human wisdom. If this idea resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me whether you have ever sensed something guiding you, and make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed to the channel. Your engagement helps this conversation grow. And as we continue, the next layer of this ancestral journey begins to reveal itself, leading us deeper into the heart of their symbolic world. As migrations grew longer and the landscapes more unpredictable, early human groups began to rely on a subtle network of meanings that helped them navigate both the physical world and the spiritual one. These journeys were not simple relocations. They were vast crossings shaped by hunger, climate shifts, hostile terrain, and the fragile hope of finding safer ground for their children. In this environment, every decision mattered, and the weight of those choices forced our ancestors to sharpen not just their instincts, but their symbolic thinking. As they moved across rivers, dense forests, and unfamiliar plains, patterns began to emerge, and those patterns slowly transformed into protective codes passed from one generation to the next. Imagine a small group advancing across a frozen valley. The wind carries a strange echo, and the elders exchange silent glances. They had heard that sound before, long ago, just before a predator emerged from the ridge. Over time, warnings like this became more than memories. They became spiritual markers, folded into stories that children learned while sitting near the fire. These early signals gave shape to a shared understanding that the natural world was speaking, offering guidance disguised as signs. Whether it was the sudden flight of birds, the behavior of distant herds, or the stillness of a night that should have been noisy, each moment added another thread to the growing web of ancestral knowledge. And as the group migrated further, this symbolic language evolved. When they crossed territories that belonged to other tribes, the landscape itself became a script. Carvings on rocks, arrangements of branches, scattered bones placed with intention, all served as hints left by unseen travelers. Some messages warned of dangerous cliffs or poisoned water. Others indicated a safe resting place, a clearing protected by natural barriers or an area where game animals had recently passed. These markings were rarely literal. Instead, they required interpretation, a blend of intuition and tradition that made the simplest symbol feel like a whisper from the unseen world. Parents, especially, clung to these meanings. The survival of their children depended on reading the land with extraordinary sensitivity. A shadow behaving strangely, a sudden shift in the temperature. Even the silence of insects could trigger a protective response. And so, within these long migrations, the earliest spiritual framework took form. It was not built in temples or carved by artisans, but shaped through movement, fear, and the relentless duty of safeguarding the young. With every step into new territory, the connection between instinct and spirituality grew stronger, binding ancestral psychology to the rhythms of the earth in ways we still recognize today. As these migrating groups pushed deeper into unfamiliar territories, the landscape itself became a vast canvas covered with symbols that only the attentive could decipher. What at first seemed like ordinary stones, broken branches, or animal bones soon revealed patterns that repeated across different regions. These markings were subtle, intentional, and layered with meaning. They were not decorative. They were warnings, teachings, and spiritual messages woven directly into the environment. For our ancestors, the world was not silent. It spoke through every contour, shadow, and shift, and survival depended on understanding this dialogue. Picture a rocky hillside where a scattered arrangement of stones forms a shape that only reveals its message when seen from a certain angle. To the untrained eye, it might look accidental, but to those who had crossed similar lands before, it signaled danger ahead, perhaps a cliff hidden by dense vegetation or a narrow path frequented by predators. These symbols served as protective anchors, helping families avoid the same tragedies that earlier travelers had endured. The knowledge was not written in words, but carried through intuition, memory, and a shared belief that the divine communicated through the land. In dense forest regions, branches bent in unnatural directions, piles of leaves arranged in spirals, or long scratches on tree trunks became part of a complex spiritual map. Some indicated water sources contaminated by illness or decay. Others pointed toward safer hunting, trails where herds often migrated. Each symbol was a gateway to understanding how previous groups had interpreted the world's hidden messages, connecting generations who would never meet, yet relied on one another for survival. Over time, these environmental codes became sacred, reinforcing the idea that the land itself was a spiritual guide, capable of protecting the vulnerable when humans learned to listen. Even the presence or absence of animal activity was understood as a symbolic message. Sudden silence in a valley, inconsistent tracks in the mud, or restless behavior among birds could all signify threats approaching. Parents in particular observed these cues with heightened sensitivity. They taught their children to read the earth the same way one reads a story, with each detail contributing to an unfolding narrative that explained where to step, where to shelter, and when to move quickly. These lessons forged a connection between instinct and interpretation that still echoes in our modern intuition. As migrations continued, these symbols accumulated, shaping not only how our ancestors traveled, but how they perceived existence itself. Every sign became part of a greater spiritual framework that tied human life to the rhythms of nature, reinforcing the belief that the world guided those who were willing to see beyond the obvious. Across these long journeys, one truth became undeniable to early human groups. Children were the most vulnerable members of the migration, and every decision revolved around keeping them alive. This is where the interpretation of divine signs became most crucial. Parents and elders believed that the world offered subtle warnings, and ignoring them could mean losing those they cherished most. When a sudden shift in the wind chilled the air, or when distant animal calls seemed out of rhythm, these cues sparked an instinctive alertness. These moments were translated into spiritual messages, shaping practices that guided how families moved, rested, and reacted to danger. For them, protection was not merely physical, it was deeply tied to an unseen force they trusted with their lives. Imagine a camp preparing to cross a vast open plain. The sky looks calm, but one elder notices the absence of birds returning to their nests. Another sees that the insects near the riverbank are restless, scattering too quickly. These observations were not dismissed as random occurrences. They were viewed as divine communication, a warning that something ahead was unsafe. Instead of crossing immediately, the group might choose to delay their journey or take a longer route that offered better concealment for the children. This adaptive behavior, grounded in spiritual symbolism, allowed entire communities to survive threats they could not yet understand through logic alone. Even small gestures became significant. A mother whispering a blessing into her child's hair before a dangerous ascent was more than ritual. It reinforced awareness, calm, and unity within the group. Fathers taught their sons to watch for the slightest disturbance in the environment, explaining how the divine often spoke through the unexpected. These teachings shaped childhood itself, turning young minds into observers of nature's hidden language. The spiritual and psychological bond formed in these moments helped preserve memory across generations, ensuring that each new wave of migrants inherited the wisdom accumulated by those who walked before them. Many of these protections were subtle, but powerful. A pile of stones arranged in a crescent shape near a forest edge might indicate a safe entry point, shielded from predators. A burnt piece of wood placed deliberately at the intersection of two trails could signal an area where a threat once struck, urging caution. These protective signs became an early form of communal guardianship, a shared promise that no child would be left without guidance from the living world. And now, thinking about these ancient strategies, I wonder how you interpret the signs around you today. Do you believe the world still whispers warnings in its own way? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me how you see these ancestral messages reflected in your own experiences, so we can continue unraveling this hidden thread together. As these symbolic protections evolved, they began to take form in the earliest rituals of passage, moments when children were formally introduced to the spiritual knowledge their community relied upon. These ceremonies were not elaborate displays but intimate exchanges, shaped by the urgency of survival and the need to transmit wisdom quickly and clearly. In small groups gathered around a fire or sheltered beneath rocky overhangs, elders taught the youngest members how to sense the world as their ancestors had, reading meaning into silence, movement, and the subtle patterns of the landscape. These rituals were the heartbeat of the migration, ensuring that knowledge did not vanish when groups split, lost members, or crossed into new territories. A child might be shown how to recognize the shift in the air that signaled approaching storms, or how to track the faint lines in the soil left by animals whose presence or absence revealed the condition of the land. These early teachings were framed as messages from forces greater than themselves, encouraging the young to treat nature as a living guide. The rituals reinforced a bond between children and the land, emphasizing that their survival depended not only on strength, but on understanding the signs that shaped every decision their group made. This knowledge was absorbed slowly, becoming instinct long before it was processed as belief. Elders often used symbolic objects during these teachings, items that carried the memory of past migrations. A carved stone passed from hand to hand might represent a journey through dangerous terrain, its markings acting as reminders of choices made under pressure. Simple pigments drawn across the skin in lines or circles told stories of past encounters, each symbol a lesson encoded in visual form. These gestures taught children that their history was not distant, but present, vibrating through every action taken during the long crossings. Even the act of holding such objects connected them to ancestors they would never meet, grounding them in continuity during a time of constant movement. The rituals also helped strengthen the psychological resilience of the young. As families traveled, dangers loomed everywhere: predators, harsh climates, scarcity of food. By framing these difficulties as part of a larger spiritual journey, the elders provided comfort and meaning, allowing children to interpret hardship not as chaos, but as a challenge with purpose. This mindset shaped how they grew, preparing them to one day assume the role of protector, interpreter, or guide. And as the group continued moving across shifting landscapes, these rituals became more than tradition. They were the thread that held the community together, ensuring that even in the harshest conditions, the knowledge of the past lived on in the minds of the youngest travelers, ready to surface whenever the world demanded it once again. As migrations pushed early human groups into harsher and more unpredictable regions, the idea of a guardian spirit began to take shape in their collective mind. This guardian was not imagined as a distant deity, but as an unseen presence, walking beside them, especially when the path grew dangerous. It was a psychological anchor, a way to cope with the fear that surged during storms, predator attacks, or long nights when every sound echoed through the dark as a possible threat. For parents, this guardian symbolized the hope that something greater watched over their children, guiding them through landscapes where a single mistake could end a lineage. The figure of the guardian often emerged from the natural world itself. A sudden burst of light through a cloudy sky might be seen as reassurance, while the appearance of a rare animal could be interpreted as a sign to proceed with caution. These interpretations were not arbitrary. They were shaped by generations of observation, by learned patterns that tied specific events to outcomes experienced during earlier migrations. Over time, these moments gained spiritual weight, evolving into stories that explained how the guardian communicated. Children grew up hearing these stories whispered beside the fire, absorbing the belief that they were never completely alone on their journey. Some groups envisioned the guardian as the spirit of an ancestor, someone who had once walked the same path and continued to offer protection from beyond. Others saw it as a force woven into the land itself, guiding travelers who respected its rhythms. Whether through footprints appearing suddenly in the mud, winds that shifted direction too purposefully to be accidental, or unusual, animal behavior preceding a threat, these experiences reinforced the belief that guidance came from the invisible. And within the uncertainty of migration, these signs provided structure, helping families make critical decisions under pressure. The guardian concept also served a social purpose. It reinforced unity, reminding each member that their survival was tied not only to their own vigilance, but also to a shared spiritual bond. Parents invoked the guardian when fear threatened to overwhelm their children, offering metaphors that transformed the unknown into something watchful rather than hostile. The presence of this symbolic protector strengthened courage, encouraged patience, and gave meaning to a journey where the horizon was constantly shifting. As the migrations continued, the guardian's role deepened, becoming a lens through which the group interpreted the world. It shaped their reactions to the unexpected and taught them that protection often appeared in forms that required careful perception. And with each generation, this unseen figure became more than belief. It became a collective memory, a quiet presence that accompanied them through valleys, forests, and plains, guiding them toward choices that might have otherwise remained hidden in the uncertainty of the surrounding wilderness. As the guardianship symbols took root in daily life, Groups learned to read not only the grand signs of nature, but also the subtle alerts that emerged in moments of silence, hesitation, or imbalance. These invisible warnings often carried the greatest weight, guiding families toward safer routes even when no obvious danger presented itself. During migration, uncertainty was constant, and it was in those uncertain spaces that early humans sharpened their awareness, trusting the quiet signals that rose from instinct and were interpreted as spiritual guidance. A sudden stillness in the air, the abrupt end of an animal track, or a flicker of movement at the edge of the horizon could all trigger a collective pause, forcing the group to observe more closely before taking another step. Some of these alerts were learned through painful experience. If a previous group had suffered loss in a particular ravine or been ambushed near a dense thicket, elders passed down the memory through symbolic warnings. These warnings were woven into stories so vivid that children felt the presence of danger even generations later. When they approached similar landscapes, the echoes of those stories resurfaced, encouraging caution without requiring explicit explanation. The land itself became layered with invisible lines, boundaries marked not by physical structures, but by shared ancestral memory. In this sense, the world became a living archive of past encounters, its patterns shaping the choices of those who walked it. Families learned to move almost as a single organism, responding to shifts in the environment with remarkable coordination. If the wind changed abruptly, they adjusted their pace. If the behavior of nearby animals contradicted expectations, they reconsidered their direction. These decisions were rarely discussed aloud. Instead, they were guided by a collective intuition, strengthened through generations of migration. Parents taught their children to trust this awareness, framing it as the voice of something ancient that sought to protect them. This belief fortified their resolve, transforming fear into vigilance and uncertainty into direction. The most powerful alerts were those that came without visible cause. A parent might wake in the middle of the night with an unshakable sense that the group needed to move. Though there was no sound, no movement, no sign to justify the instinct, the group often followed these impulses, believing them to be messages transmitted by forces beyond their understanding. And often, these choices saved lives, helping them avoid predators, storms, or treacherous terrain that revealed their danger only hours later. Over time, these moments shaped the group's trust in intuition, blending the psychological and the spiritual into a single guiding force. These ancestral alerts still echo in our modern instincts, the ones that make us pause before entering a room or take a different route without knowing why. I would love to know how you interpret these subtle signals in your own life. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me whether you, too, have felt these invisible warnings shaping your path. As migrations stretched across seasons and generations, there were moments when instinct and the sacred became indistinguishable, forming a single guiding force that shaped how families protected their children. In these moments, the boundary between human intuition and divine communication blurred, giving rise to a shared belief that the world itself collaborated with them. When hunters noticed unusual harmony or tension in the movements of animals, or when parents sensed a sudden urgency beneath the calm surface of the landscape, these impressions were treated as messages not to be ignored. The combination of instinctive awareness and spiritual interpretation allowed early human groups to survive environments that seemed determined to test their endurance. Children grew up watching their parents move with an attentiveness that felt almost supernatural. A quick glance exchanged between elders could redirect an entire caravan, while the faintest sound carried on the wind could determine whether they took shelter or pressed forward. These decisions were never arbitrary. They stemmed from layers of accumulated knowledge, past experiences encoded into stories, and the deep psychological bond that humans formed with the land. When a mother gathered her child close as the sky shifted color, or when a father halted the group because the rhythm of the forest changed, the younger members learned to recognize these subtle cues as part of a greater spiritual vocabulary. Many of these protective choices emerged from a blending of memory and perception. A change in the way birds circled above a valley might recall an old tale of danger, while the scent of approaching rain could revive a warning passed down through generations. The children who witnessed this process grew into adults who understood that safety depended on listening to the world with more than their ears. They learned to interpret silence as meaning, movement as guidance, and stillness as invitation or threat. And with each new migration, this dynamic relationship between instinct and spirituality deepened, reinforcing the idea that the unseen and the intuitive were partners in the work of survival. In particularly dangerous regions, this union became vital. The land could shift without warning. Predators could move silently, and storms could sweep across the plains with devastating speed. When faced with these uncertainties, the group relied heavily on those who possessed the strongest intuitive perception. These individuals were not chosen for leadership through force or status. They were recognized because they sensed danger before others noticed any sign. Their insight was interpreted as a spiritual gift, an ability to feel what the world whispered beneath its surface. Families trusted these individuals implicitly, following their guidance even when logic offered no explanation. Through this delicate balance of instinct and sacred interpretation, communities found their safest paths forward. What kept them alive was not strength alone, but an extraordinary sensitivity to the natural world. A sensitivity that transformed survival into a spiritual act, and made every decision a continuation of the messages left by those who had walked the earth long before them. As migrations carved their way across continents, the routes early humans followed became layered with traces of those who had traveled before them. These traces were not simply footprints or abandoned tools. They were intentional marks carrying spiritual weight, reminders that others had faced the same dangers, the same doubts, the same fierce need to protect their young. Over time, these markings transformed into a silent dialogue across generations, linking families who would never meet but who depended on one another for survival. Each symbol etched into stone or arranged along a trail was a message preserved in the landscape, a testament to the ongoing relationship between humanity and the unseen forces they believed walked beside them. Imagine approaching a narrow pass where jagged rocks created shadows that shifted unpredictably with the wind. On one side of the trail, a spiraled arrangement of stones hinted at caution, a symbol taught through stories around the fire. Travelers who recognized it adjusted their pace, scanning the cliffs above them for possible threats. These marks were more than warnings. They were assurances that someone before them had survived, long enough to leave guidance behind. They offered comfort in unfamiliar territory and reinforced the belief that the world itself held memory, that the land remembered what people wished to protect. Some markings celebrated moments of safety rather than danger. A cluster of smooth stones placed near a sheltered grove might indicate a resting place discovered during a previous migration, a space where children were protected from harsh winds or predators. Groups arriving later felt the presence of those earlier families, as if the land itself had been touched by their relief, their gratitude. These subtle signs shaped how people moved, turning vast and intimidating terrain into a path marked not only by risk, but by hope. The marks served as proof that survival was possible, even in the harshest conditions. In other areas, the symbols grew more complex. Parallel lines carved into tree bark, patterns traced in sand, or bones arranged in deliberate formations hinted at deeper interpretations. These marks often carried layered meanings that only those raised within the tradition could understand. Elders taught children how to read these symbols with precision, passing down not only the literal guidance, but also the spiritual stories behind them. Through this teaching, each new generation inherited not just the knowledge of safe routes, but also the belief that these markings were echoes of divine intervention, guiding them as they protected the weakest among them. As Patuajuan, migration routes expanded over centuries. These sacred traces formed a network of memory that helped preserve the identity of each group. They became reminders of shared struggle, shared resilience, and shared connection to something beyond themselves. And even as the world changed, the marks remained, quiet witnesses to the enduring bond between human instinct, spiritual belief, and the timeless effort to keep children safe amid the uncertainties of the natural world. As the echoes of these ancient migrations continued through time, the spiritual framework our ancestors built did not disappear. It evolved quietly within human memory, shaping the way later generations understood intuition, danger, purpose, and protection. Even though the markers carved into stone have eroded and the symbolic arrangements along old trails have been scattered by wind and rain, the essence of those messages survives in the instinctive caution we feel when entering an unfamiliar place or the sudden sense of reassurance that washes over us without explanation. These reactions are not accidents. They are remnants of a psychological and spiritual inheritance crafted by people who depended on every sign, every shift in the world, to shield their children from harm. In their journeys, these early humans created something far greater than a system of symbols. They established a tradition of listening deeply to the environment, trusting the interplay between instinct and the unseen. They believed that the world communicated with them, not through spoken language, but through patterns, movements, and subtle impressions. Modern life may feel disconnected from the landscapes our ancestors crossed, yet the foundations they laid continue to influence how we interpret the unknown. The protective impulse they nurtured still pulses within us, guiding decisions we rarely stop to analyze. When a parent senses danger before any visible sign appears, or when a traveler changes direction without knowing why, these moments carry the faint outline of those ancient teachings. The enduring power of their messages lies not only in the symbols they left behind, but in the mindset they cultivated. They lived with an understanding that survival required awareness, reflection, and unity with both the physical and spiritual worlds. Their migrations were not simply movements through territory, they were journeys through layers of meaning. Every decision was shaped by the belief that protection came from paying attention, from honoring the past, and from trusting the invisible threads that connect human life to the world around it. And as generations passed, these threads strengthened, forming a lineage of wisdom that continues to shape our inner landscape. Even now, when we step into unfamiliar terrain, there is a quiet part of us that listens for something older than memory. It listens for the echoes of those who walked before us, for the protective messages they embedded in the earth, the sky, and the movements of living things. Their legacy is not distant history, but a presence woven into our instincts, urging us to see the world not only with our eyes, but with the depth of perception they once depended on. If you reached this point, let me know by commenting the phrase, "This message found me." And if this journey into our ancestral past inspired you, consider subscribing to the channel so you can explore more stories like this with me. A like on this video helps keep these ideas alive. And if you feel connected to this topic, there is another video waiting for you right here that expands on these themes. Click and continue the exploration with me as we follow the messages our ancestors left behind.